I wish you could see my view. It's really astounding. Welcome to the Zeckelman Holocaust Center. I'm Gabi Berman, the Director of Marketing and Communications, and it is wonderful to be together. We are thrilled that for our first live in-person event of 2023, we are celebrating women. As the mother of daughters, this is very important to me. As we will learn in tonight's program, women have been at the forefront of historical events, whether in front of or behind the scenes, but their stories have largely gone untold. At the Zeckelman Holocaust Center, our mission is to engage, educate, and empower by remembering the Holocaust, and we are so fortunate to have survivors in the audience with us tonight. We hope that when you leave tonight's presentation, you will be inspired to go back to your own communities and boost awareness, that we do not have to wait until tragedy strikes to learn the dangers of unchecked hate. On behalf of the center, I want to acknowledge and thank PNC Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event. I also want to thank our program, yes, go ahead. I also want to thank our program supporters, Robin and Leo Eisenberg, Susan and Robert Gordon, Sandy Schreier, Sarah Geyer and Scott Strauss, and Stacy and Mark Wittenberg. Lastly, thank you to our community partners, the Wayne State University Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program, and the University of Detroit Mercy Women's and Gender Studies program. By the same token, I invite and urge you all to support and participate in the educational programming that we are so fortunate to be able to provide to the tens of thousands who benefit from having the Zeckelman Holocaust Center here in our state of Michigan. There is no substitute, as you all know, for education. The more students and adults that we impact, the greater the likelihood that we can all stand up against anti-Semitism, prejudice, and hate. At this time, I would like to ask you all to please silence your telephones, and I invite Sarah Pobosic from PNC Bank to say a few words. Thank you, Sarah.
Good evening. Well, this is great. To have a full room for an event is just amazing. My name is Sarah Pobosic. I am the market leader for commercial banking at PNC Bank. At PNC, we are so honored to be a program sponsor for the Zeckelman Holocaust Center. Our support for this event aligns with our core values of respect, integrity, and inclusion. The stories shared at these events help us remember the remarkable individuals who were lost, who resisted, who survived, and those who fought for justice. These stories help us connect the atrocities of the past with current events and teach us how we can shape a better world today. Tonight, we focus on the experiences of women. Throughout history, the experiences of women have often been overshadowed by the men in their circle, and I'm so interested to see their stories come to light tonight. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Amy Lang. Amy has been a reporter and anchor with Fox 2 News for 25 years. From politics to courts to social issues, Lang's Emmy Award reporting has allowed her to cover some of the most important stories of our time, including the Flint water crisis. Please join me in welcoming Amy Lang.
Thank you so much to Sarah, and thank you to all of you for spending your International Women's Day with us here tonight. It is wonderful to see you, all of the women out there, all of the men supporting women out there. As Sarah said before we came up, you know, women's issues are all of our issues. And so it's really important that we take this time tonight and we remember and we learn and we educate ourselves. Where are all the women? Untold experiences from the Holocaust. We're going to hear about this tonight from a really wonderful speaker that we're so excited and lucky to have in our presence tonight. If you know Katie, you know that she combines her activism and action with academics. Her academic pursuits are lengthy, but she, Katie Chaka Parks, is a Ph.D. candidate in European history at Wayne State University currently. She has taught courses for the history department in gender, sexuality, and women's studies program. She has also been working on her dissertation, and that research addresses the experience of women during the Holocaust and the inclusion and exclusion of women's stories from museum exhibits throughout the world. In addition, Katie is the manager of adult education right here at the center. So you may know her from this wonderful museum. In this role, she serves today's changemakers to apply the lessons of history's darkest period to realize a vision for a better world where people take responsible action. After the presentation from Katie, we're going to go ahead and have a little discussion. We're going to take some questions from the audience, and we invite you to welcome Katie Chaka Parks as she takes us on a little journey.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for that very kind introduction, and thank you all so much for coming to the Zeckelman Holocaust Center tonight. It really is so wonderful to see so many people here. I'd like to talk first about a short story to begin our discussion tonight. In 1989, historians John Roth and Michael Berenbaum edited an influential volume on foundational reflections on the Holocaust, entitled Holocaust, Religious and Philosophical Implications. However, when another historian, Carol Rittner, received her copy of the book, she called her friend John to congratulate him on his successes and asked him one very short question, but where are all the women? A foundational reflections on the Holocaust, and none of them included anything about women. So much of this question has guided a significant amount of my own research and the passion that I have for Holocaust education, and it's a question that we're going to be answering a little bit together tonight. Where are all the women? Women experienced every facet of the Holocaust. They experienced laws that discriminated against their abilities to reproduce. They experienced the ghettos and in hiding. They struggled to survive through various means of resistance. They endured the concentration and death camps. Other women, of course, aided in Nazi genocide and crimes against humanity. They voted. They were camp guards. They were nurses selecting people for sterilization. They were wives creating comfortable homes for men in the killing fields. And yet, with all of this, where are all the women in the history of the Holocaust? I argue that Carol Rittner's question is really more emblematic of larger issues that we have surrounding Holocaust scholarship and its representations in broader society today. So in honor of this very special International Women's Day, we're going to talk through some of these conclusions of why are women often left out of the major narratives of the Holocaust. And more so, I'd like to spend most of our time this evening actually looking at 4 different case studies of women and what we can learn from their individual experiences. Now, please do not misunderstand me. We certainly cannot learn everything about women in the Holocaust by learning about 4 women. And yet, learning about their experiences is just going to be the tip of the iceberg to understanding the breadth of experiences of women during this period. I think we need to tell these stories because they're often untold, and not just because of that, but because, as Amy mentioned, it makes us all better. Women's history is history. Women experienced the Holocaust differently because they were women. And that's a very fundamental fact that we often don't really talk about. As such, we need to remember and learn about their experiences in order to have a more direct conversation about genocide and its realities, because we all know that they still occur today. I think in many respects, it actually boils down to memory. The Holocaust, of course, has become sort of this epic example of the collection and transfer of memory. And it's also been this sort of use of historical memory as a tool to not only learn about the past, but enact change in the present. But when we're thinking about these stories that sort of illuminate the human experience during the Holocaust, which stories are we thinking about? Right? When we think about the people that perpetuated the Holocaust, whether those who committed these acts or who suffered by them, the names that often come to mind are male, and more often than that, male perpetrators. So how are we telling the complete history of the Holocaust if we're neglecting nearly half of the people that experienced it? One of my famous, she's not my famous, one of my favorite famous feminist writers is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And she tells this warning about monolithic narratives in her well-known talk, The Danger of a Single Story. She tells different stories within this work where she gives personal anecdotes about how if we only present one monolithic narrative as the dominant truth, then we not only risk critically misunderstanding one another, but we critically misunderstand ourselves and our own history. What I find, I think, to be most relevant about her work is her discussion on the relationship between memory and power. She says, and I quote, "It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. Like our economic and political worlds, stories, too, are defined by the principle of power. How they're told, who tells them, when they're told, how many stories are told, are really dependent upon this idea of power. Power is the ability to not just tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person." When we think about the production of memory, Adichie's warning is a very powerful reminder. If we relegate women's stories to the background, we're not only inaccurately portraying power dynamics in the past, but we're reproducing them in the present. So how did we get here? I think that's an important thing to talk about and something that people often always ask. Because how did we erase the dominant accounts of women in these major narratives of the Holocaust? Issues of power and gender within historical research first became prevalent in the 1960s with the dawn of women's history. The academic study of history for women did not certainly aim to rewrite history, as its critics often feared. But what it aimed to do was sort of readjust the lens through which we look at history. Not only focus on just great men, but great women. And more than that, ordinary women that are often much more than ordinary. To re-look at these different questions with a new sort of answer to them. Some of the earliest feminist historians that were studying the Holocaust at this point were very concerned with women's stories being absorbed into the lives of men. They very rightfully worried that the Holocaust in general was actually being boiled down into this one specific holistic event, completely ignoring the variety of experiences of both men and women, and how gender played a role in those experiences. The first Holocaust museums began being built in the 1980s, the 1990s, the early 2000s. And though their exhibits were informed by academic research, they didn't include most anything about women. Critics of women's history have often long said that focusing on the experiences of women really detracted from the much more fundamental fact that people did not experience the Holocaust as men or women or children, but as Jews. There are other critics that genuinely just find it uncomfortable to talk about women's issues. They don't want to talk about the loss of menstruation or pregnancy or the loss of pregnancy or rape or sexual assault. We're often taught that these things are uncomfortable, to assume that women can't be violent. I think this idea that these topics are taboo is just one more way of silencing women. If we can talk about the murder and the dehumanization of over 6 million Jews during the Holocaust, we can certainly sit in a comfortable auditorium and talk about topics that might be a little bit uncomfortable. And so I encourage you to sort of lean into that. It's important to have these conversations within an amazing space like this educational center. We have to really move away from this idea that everybody experienced the Holocaust in the same way. It was, again, not this monolithic event. Both men and women experienced the Holocaust differently, And all of their experiences are valid and important and integral into understanding this time period. I truly can't say enough that the denial of difference does nothing to help us. It does nothing to teach us about the Holocaust or to teach future generations about how to learn about difficult topics. And we certainly cannot silence the stories of victims and survivors out of mere sexism. We just can't do it anymore. So with that, I'd like to turn to some of those case studies of these individual women and how, again, learning about some of their stories can teach us a little bit about the breadth of experiences during the Holocaust. Once the Nazis officially came to power in 1933, they started quickly enacting anti-Jewish legislation aimed at perpetually shrinking Jewish lives and freedoms. By 1938, though, we see the events of Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, as some believed that this was a significant turning point in policy towards the Jews. This was 2 nights of violence towards the Jewish people, and I think the most important part that we all need to remember is it was state-sponsored, right? It's not just interpersonal relationships anymore, or bias, or even acts of bias. It's actually state-sponsored persecution, and in some cases, murder. This was 2 nights over November 9th and 10th of 1938, where you had people attacking Jews on the streets, in their homes, in their places of business, in their places of worship. There are over 7,000 homes and businesses that are destroyed. You can see from some of these images here of the broken glass on the storefronts. There were 1,400 synagogues that were burned. There were hundreds of people that were injured, 100 murdered. Police and firefighters were told, don't go put out the fire or any violence unless it was spreading to non-Jewish properties or non-Jewish people. A good reminder that a lot of people that vowed to protect and serve often lost their way during this period. Cemeteries and schools were vandalized, and the Jews at the end of all of this were made to actually pay for the reparations and pay for the damages done to them. And at the very end of this event, 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and taken to the camps. Now that's an important part of this. 30,000 men were rounded up and taken to the camps. In almost every single account of Kristallnacht, that's how it ends. These stories are extremely important, and we need to tell them, and we need to learn about men and their experiences of being taken away, and we do. But where are all the women? What happens to women when 30,000 men are taken away in the blink of an eye? What happens when women are the ones left behind as the sole providers for their family, taking care of the children and elderly? What happens to them? Where are those stories? It's not a small amount of people, right? 30,000 people, 30,000 families were affected by that, and yet we don't talk about it. Work had been, of course, very difficult for all Jews to find after 1933 with the purging of the civil services and different professions. And yet, again, we often don't reference that many women could actually still work in domestic service at this point because it was seen as a lowly enough job that people didn't mind if Jewish women still did this up to a certain point. So again, people are working. They always worked. So many different people experienced the events of Kristallnacht, and Ida Abraham is just one of those people, one of those stories. Here at the Zeckelman Holocaust Center, we very much value individual stories. We understand that this history feels so big and the facts and the figures, but if you understand a person's story, if you hear their testimony, you are then witness to that testimony as well. So that's why I feel, truly very honored and responsible for telling these stories to you. Ida Abraham, whose passport you can see right here, was from a very small town called Frickhofen, Germany, and she came from a very comfortable family, a loving family, and she was taught to sew at a very young age by her grandmother. She and her husband, Albrecht, welcomed their very sweet baby boy, Harry, to the world on March 15th, 1938. This was only 8 months before Kristallnacht occurred, and during the terror of the events, her husband was actually out of town. And so while he was out of town, she was at home alone with the baby, and a rock flew through the window, landing right next to where her baby was sleeping. Ida's husband and younger brother, Siegfried, were among those 30,000 men that were taken away to the camps. After these events finally settled down, of course, for some and not for others, the SS in the area put a lot of pressure on people to not associate with the Jews, and in Frickhofen in particular, they specifically wanted to cut off the food source to the Jews. Now, we can, of course, see how calculated this is. Ida was terrified as to how she was going to feed her child, something that many of us in this room have maybe thought about before. She had no idea how she was going to get her child milk, and there was one woman who was not Jewish from the town who would sneak her milk for her son. It often only took one person to change the course of someone's life, and I genuinely don't think that I could do the work that I do here at the museum if I didn't believe that to my core, believe that our individual choices actually matter, and they matter so much to people even if they seem small to us. Ida worked tirelessly to secure papers to get her husband and her brother out of Buchenwald concentration camp. She went to so many different places, and she eventually landed on this thought that she was going to send them to Shanghai. Shanghai had no visa requirements for entry at this point, something that was not common among other countries. There was a significant amount of red tape where Jews could not escape and go to other places. But Shanghai was one of these bright spots, and so this is where she was going to get them out and send them to. She went to so many different government agencies trying to acquire papers to get them out. She went to different people for help, people that told her that they would help her one day and the next turn around and say, well, we'll give you these papers for double the amount of money, right? Profiting off of her family's misery. But thanks to Ida's efforts, she actually was able to gain these papers and resources, and the men were actually released from Buchenwald concentration camp with the express purpose that they would leave the country within 4 weeks. Harry's son, Ida, who actually you can see pictured here later in life, has this really wonderful quote about his mother. He says, she was a very, very determined and very, very involved type of individual. My father was on the quiet side, not my mother. My mother was tough. She was hard-nosed and sometimes difficult, but that difficulty was what created the ability to accomplish what she accomplished. After her husband and brother were safe in Shanghai, she realized she had to continue working to get the rest of the family out of Germany. How was she going to save everyone else? While she begged her parents to leave, they wouldn't. Her father was a very decorated veteran of World War I of the German Navy, and he didn't want to leave. He thought that he was a prominent figure. He was a prominent figure, and he thought that they wouldn't come after him. People had no idea what was coming next, right? They don't know what we know sitting in this room. So Ida eventually had to leave with just herself and her son and her Singer sewing machine. Any of you that have had children before know how difficult traveling is. I can't imagine her travel to Shanghai alone with an infant. And yet she made it there, and not only did she make it there, but she ended up being one of the most prominent seamstresses in the Jewish community in Shanghai. She really was a force to be reckoned with. After the war, she was able to apply for visas for her family to be able to come to the United States. And in 1947, she eventually ended up in Cleveland, Ohio. In all of these moves, Ida was able to find work because of her domestic skills in a way that her husband Albrecht was not able to find employment as easily. For the next 30 years in the United States, she actually worked for Sears, which might sound familiar to some of us, and she worked in the production of slipcovers, and she eventually died at the age of 93 years old in 2003. Ida Abraham worked hard to keep her family together. She did everything that she could. Barriers to immigration, people being taken away, having to leave families and being broken apart. And her story is not uncommon. Unfortunately, this is a quite common story of the Holocaust, and yet so many women were faced with these challenges that we don't really hear about from their perspective. These women face these challenges and they use their place as women specifically to help their families and other people the best that they could, given the dire circumstances that they were in. Again, this is her son Harry here and her Singer sewing machine all these years later. And I think it's really wonderful. He said she wanted to make sure that the family was going to survive. That was her role. With the outbreak of World War II in September of 1939, the lives of Jews outside of German territory, outside of Selma's world, started to significantly become affected by the Nazi regime. As the Nazis invaded, they created ghettos to isolate and dehumanize Jews into little pockets in different areas so that they could keep them there as a way of keeping them in a holding cell until they were ready for them. Selma Velman was from the Netherlands when her home country was invaded in 1940. Selma grew up with a very, very loving family. Oops, we're on the wrong slide. We'll go back. A very loving family who we can see here on the right. This is her father, Ben, who was an entertainer, a performer. Her mother, Femme, who was a hat maker by trade. She went to school for this, but she actually, because she wasn't allowed to have a profession at the time, her family was more traditional, she used her skills to be able to make clothes for her family. You can see here her older brothers, Louis and David, and she also had a younger sister that she adored named Clara. Her family, in her words, were not particularly religious, but their Judaism was essential to their core identity. They often moved around a lot because of her father's profession in the entertainment industry, and he wanted her to become a scientist when she grew up, which she thought was always very progressive for the time, and I would certainly have to agree. Selma was 20 years old, similar to this picture in the center, when her entire world was turned upside down. Her father was taken away to Auschwitz concentration camp, and her brothers were away already fighting in the war, and she knew she had to do something to save her and her mother and her younger sister. She was actually able to acquire a hiding spot for her mother and her sister, and she then dyed her own hair blonde and lived in plain sight, hiding her Judaism, hiding who she was, living under false aliases so that she could try to survive. Eventually, though, Selma joined the Dutch resistance movement, and she was given the job of a courier. Now, this title might not sound very familiar because, again, we don't often talk about it. And yet, she traveled all over the Netherlands, all over Belgium, through the border to France, with suitcases full of newsletters, pamphlets, money, food stamps, false identity documents for people in hiding. In her memoir, she actually stated that she was able to conduct her research and resistance for the resistance movement because the Germans were far less suspicious of young women than they were of young men. I'd like to take just 1 second to talk about female couriers in general because many people really don't realize that from the beginning of the war, female couriers acted as a lifeline to Jewish communities throughout Europe. Like Selma, the majority of these young women didn't look stereotypically Jewish, and so they were able to live in plain sight, and they were the ones that were transporting documents. They maintained papers, mail, money, and they even were able to smuggle in weapons and firearms into the ghettos. Couriers also maintained contact between the ghettos and forced resistance movements, and the mass murder of the Jews throughout Europe initially came to be known within the ghettos because of these female couriers and the information that they gathered. Their role was integral to both spiritual and armed resistance during the Holocaust. Now, on one of Selma's most dangerous missions, she actually had to cross the border into France, and she had to go into a German headquarters. So imagine just, she's hiding in plain sight, she knows her Jewish identity, and she's going into a German headquarters. She's supposed to gain papers from somebody that works there, and then take them back immediately to the Netherlands. She said that she spoke as little as possible on this mission. She was very nervous about being discovered, but she said that she was able to sort of flirt with suggestive looks to the guards upon entering into the headquarters, and nobody paid her any attention. The reason she was going on this mission in the first place was there were men from the resistance movement that were being held within a French prison, and she knew that if she didn't succeed in her mission, that they would be murdered. Though this was terrifying for her, under all accounts this would be terrifying for anyone, she was able to walk in and out of the German headquarters without any trouble. And she later learned that, her status as sort of a woman of no importance, with nobody looking either way to see or care who she was coming in and out. Because of her efforts, the men that were in prison there were freed. Like many women, she used her unassuming role to her advantage. This isn't always necessarily as easy as it seems, though. There were different points throughout her story where she had to fake date a Nazi officer in order to gain documents that might help the resistance. She was also sexually assaulted by somebody that was helping to hide her identity. These types of vulnerabilities of sexual assault in the ghettos, in hiding in the camps, were not necessarily uncommon. And for her, this was even happening in plain sight. Selma was eventually discovered for her resistance activities, and she was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. So Ravensbrück concentration camp was a really interesting case study, and it might be a name that may or may not sound familiar to you, though it should. It was a camp that was roughly 50 miles outside of Berlin, and it's most notorious for being the largest concentration camp exclusively for imprisoning women. In the concentration camp system, Ravensbrück was second in size only to the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. This camp was the first of its kind to be built expressly for imprisoning women. And the camp became notorious for the infamous experimentations on women within the camp, primarily aimed at unethically researching reproduction and fertility. Once Selma arrived within Ravensbrück, she could not comprehend the horrors around her. She was absolutely horrified. She detailed the intimate examinations that were performed on women by doctors upon their entrance into the camp, and we should absolutely read that as sexual assault. These women were sexually assaulted upon entering the camp, and they were further dehumanized as a way of scaring them and stripping them of their identity upon entrance into these camps. She also details the shaving of women's hair, which was a horrific experience for all victims of the Holocaust, absolutely no doubt. And yet, because of pre-war gender norms, many women detail the shaving of their heads as being this horrific experience because somebody was taking away their femininity. It was a complete loss of their identity and who they were. During her time in Ravensbrück, Selma worked as a slave laborer in the Siemens factory that was actually on the concentration camp grounds. So again, another good reminder of every level of society that was involved in this horrific genocide. At one point during her stay at Ravensbrück, she was asked by camp guards if she would like to be transferred to another camp to join a mother's home. She had no idea what a mother's home was. She'd never heard of this before. And so she said, no, I would like to stay here, which was quite astounding that they didn't fight her. They let her stay. It was perhaps one of her many miracles. She later realized what they were asking her to do was to join a brothel within one of the camps. What ended up happening was these brothels were in the camps, and they were used for the sole express purpose of rewarding male prisoners for their good deeds and production, and in unofficial cases, SS men as well. We don't talk about the camp brothels. Often, it's never referenced. Selma was liberated from Ravensbrück in 1945. After the war ended, she met a very nice man in one of the displaced persons camps, one of the camps that was created on the grounds of the concentration camps for survivors after the war so that they could put their lives back together, regain their health, figure out what was next. And she has this really great quote. She says, "He asked me to marry him, but I didn't feel quite ready for that. My freedom was too precious to me, and I intended to seize every opportunity that came my way." While she later did marry, I think it's a really interesting point that she talks about this loss of freedom and that she couldn't go back to the life that she had potentially maybe lived before the Holocaust. These bold excursions that she went on, she wasn't ready to give all of that up and just become married again and you know, sort of a part of pre-war gender norms right after the Holocaust. To close her story, in 1983, Selma was actually awarded a very, very important distinction on behalf of Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, and this was the Resistance Memorial Cross. And at 100 years old, she still lives in London to this day. Selma survived Ravensbrück and the entirety of the Holocaust, and she and so many other survivors have done the important work of detailing the camp guards and their experiences with them within the Holocaust. While Ravensbrück was a camp that was specifically intended for housing female prisoners, it also served as a training camp for female camp guards within the concentration camp system. Many people don't realize that roughly 10% of all guards were actually women. We as people, again, we don't often like to attribute violence to women, and historian Wendy Lauer, who is truly one of my idols, has this amazing quote that I'd like to read for you that's displayed right here. She says, "To assume that violence is not a feminine characteristic and that women are not capable of mass murder has obvious appeal. It allows hope that at least half the human race will not devour the other, that it will protect children and so safeguard the future. But minimizing the violent behavior of women creates a false shield against more direct confrontation with genocide and its disconcerting realities." I could not agree more with this if I tried. We have to not only talk about the survivors and the victims, but we have to talk about women that perpetrated crimes during the Holocaust as well. We have to understand and learn from this so that we don't continually perpetuate this in the present. Now, we all know, of course, genocides still occur today, but are we looking at them through a gendered lens? Maybe we should. Shortages of soldiers away at war pushed the Nazis to begin recruiting for the role of female guards within camps, like Ravensbrück as well as other camps. Women were encouraged to pursue these positions through newspaper advertisements, showing young, physically fit women who were happy, who in impressive-looking SS uniforms, even though they were not technically a part of the SS. And they often were accompanied by slogans that said, "You only have to watch over prisoners." Certainly not saying anything about the moral complexities, to say the least, of what camp guard work would entail. Women within these roles typically made a substantially more amount of money than that of factory work or other professions that women were able to do within Germany. More than that, though, it gave them the opportunity to believe that they were doing something that was seen as highly important work for Germany. Clearly, this work required a significant amount of ideological commitment and anti-Semitism, though this was certainly attempted to be debunked later at the trials after the war ended. Brutality and violence were rewarded and encouraged among guards of both sexes, men and women alike, and the guards at Ravensbrück were certainly no different. And one of these guards that I'd like to talk about this evening was a woman named Irma Griese. She was nicknamed by prisoners the beautiful beast and the angel of death, and her sort of role as a female camp guard was sensationalized by guards and prisoners alike. This was due to her youth, her beauty, and her vicious ferociousness. She came from a lower-class agricultural family. She had very little education, no higher education, and she joined to be a camp guard in her late teens. Though, interestingly enough, at her trial after the war, she would argue that she was conscripted, that she was forced to join, though this, of course, was a lie. For Griese, becoming a camp guard opened so many doors that would not have been open to her otherwise. She became a camp guard at the young age of 19 years old, and in March of 1943, she was actually transferred to Auschwitz from Ravensbrück, and there she slowly but quickly became the senior SS supervisor within the camp. Here she was in charge of overseeing 30,000 female prisoners, mostly Polish and Hungarian Jews. This was the second highest rank of any woman within the camps, and she very much reveled in that. Griese worked primarily in Ravensbrück, in Bergen-Belsen, and in Auschwitz, and she became notoriously known for her sexual deviance. She took many male SS lovers within the camps, but she also repeatedly raped female and male prisoners for fun. Though she claimed, again, not to have specifically joined as a camp guard for anti-Semitic reasons, she also testified to murdering roughly 30 people per day. This led many people then and now to believe that she was one of the cruelest women in all of the camp structures. After the war, Irma Griese and other female guards were put on trial in what's known as the Belsen case to atone for their crimes. The survivors there provided extensive details of the murders, tortures, cruelties, and sexual excesses engaged in by Irma Griza while she was a camp guard. They testified to her pure acts of sadism, of beatings, arbitrary shootings, sicking her dog on prisoners, and selecting people for the gas chambers. Griza was, of course, convicted for her crimes, and she was sentenced to be hanged, and she was executed on December 13th, 1945. Irma Griza's actions as a concentration camp guard are emblematic of the larger structures of violence that women participated in during World War II and the Holocaust. While this is sort of one extreme end of female perpetration, we have to remember that women supported the Nazi regime in a ton of seemingly other mundane ways that also helped to perpetuate genocide. Wendy Lauer, who I mentioned earlier, has a very wonderful book called Hitler's Furies, and there she talks about how these separate spheres of men and women within German society might not be quite as separate as we often thought. She argues that women, like their male counterparts, were absolutely a part of creating the culture for death and destruction, and that they were absolutely integral in the Nazi killing machine, as were their male counterparts. She estimates that at least 500,000 German women were responsible for the demise of the other throughout Germany and other occupied territories during the Holocaust. Women performed unspeakable acts of cruelty in the name of their own agency, and they did so not just as female camp guards like Griza. Many German women were involved in indoctrinating society, as well as excluding and exterminating groups within it. They were also teachers. They taught children how to become indoctrinated within schools, how to pick out Jewish children. They tortured Jewish children within classrooms. They were also nurses, selecting patients for sterilization, the ones administering the lethal injections, regardless of a male doctor above them telling them what to do. Women were secretaries. They had mundane desk jobs, and these jobs were also extremely important in creating the organizational means to implement the final solution. It's a good reminder that on every single level of society, people were involved in the destruction of other people, and women were absolutely a part of this. I think, again, that it's a good reminder that we study women not just as survivors and as victims, but also as perpetrators. We have to have this more direct conversation about what female perpetration and violence looks like, because it helps us better understand all of the history of the Holocaust. You can see here this image on the left is her right before she joined, and this image on the right was after her capture. Our last example that I'd like to talk about this evening is that of Dr. Gisela Perl, whose moving story is really emblematic of the involvement of women in the medical professions during the Holocaust. I have to warn you, this one, it gets me every time talking about her. I think it's, again, a good sort of litmus test that we have to remember that these stories are not just stories, they're people's lives, and they're their legacies, and they should move us. And we should be uncomfortable, and we should have to fight back tears sometimes when we think about them, even when we draw strength and empowerment from their amazing tales. The direct persecution of the Jews and other groups of people was not possible without co-opting certain sectors of society, and the medical profession was certainly one of these. The medical field was a large contributor to the spread of Nazi ideology, and many medical personnel were complicit in Nazi crimes and welcomed being a part of it. While some doctors chose to aid in Nazi genocide and terror, others really wanted to be upstanders and help to save humanity. In 1933, Jewish doctors were expelled from performing care on anybody else that was not Jewish. And yet this did not mean that Jewish doctors and medical professionals did not stop helping people. Many Jewish doctors and nurses administered aid within the ghettos, within the camps, and they did what they could to help and save those that they could, regardless of the dehumanization and murder that was all around them. In some ghettos and camps, surprisingly, doctors were actually told that they were allowed to take their medical supplies with them into the ghettos and the camps, or they were given meager supplies when they were there. This was, of course, to preserve the Nazi workforce at the same time as the Nazis were exterminating the Jews of Europe. An example of Jewish resistance, really resistance to its core, and somebody that fought these Nazi eugenic measures was again Dr. Gisela Perl. Perl was a woman who was from Siget, Hungary, who came from a very loving family with her husband and two children. She spoke multiple different languages, and everybody, her siblings, her family, they were highly intelligent. But her father was very worried when she wanted to go to school to become a gynecologist because he worried it would take her a little bit away from her Judaism. And she made a vow to him that she would never, ever leave her faith or her identity behind her, and she never did. She was imprisoned in Auschwitz-Birkenau. You can see images of her here as a medical student and here after the war. And she was there met by somebody that we might know the name of, the infamous Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was the doctor of Auschwitz that was quite known for his experiments on human subjects. He was told, or he told Gisela Perl, to report to him all of the pregnant women within the camp. Once he learned about her specialty, he wanted to use her talents for his purposes. Many survivors note throughout their testimonies that women that entered the camps with young children or women that were pregnant, it was considered an immediate death sentence. And Pearl knew this, and she started to learn this quite quickly. One of her first encounters within the camps that's difficult to hear about was she saw a group of pregnant women that were rounded up, and they were beaten to death by guards and dogs. Pregnant women that she was told to find. And she made a vow that she would never help them like this again, that she would do everything in her power to save women that she could. Understanding, of course, that pregnant women were marked for death, Dr. Pearl hid them if possible, performed abortions under the cover of night, and quietly delivered newborn children and killed them so that their mothers would survive. While Dr. Gisela Perl took an oath to do no harm, she knew that she had to invert her skills as a healer, as a bringer of life, so that she could save Jewish women, so that they could live to see another day where they could have children again, and those children would live. So many women during the Holocaust were not surprisingly worried about reproductive issues. This is not uncommon to today. Many women of childbearing age were very concerned about pregnancies, whether they entered the camp as pregnant, whether they were worried about rapes within the camp and becoming pregnant. They were also worried about infertility as a result of conditions within the camps. Historian S. Lillian Kramer argues that in addition to this fear of becoming infertile while they were in the camps, they were also horrified of would their fertility come back when they left, if they left. She argues that this was actually a dual psychological assault on women, and I would certainly agree. Many of these worries that women had revolved also around menstruation. Many women suffered the loss of menstruation within the camps due to a low caloric intake, as well as the genuine shock of what was happening to them. There are some accounts of women who were actually forced to ingest a tar-like liquid aimed at mass sterilizing women in one fell swoop. There's also stories that many of these women that had to ingest this liquid, all of their first children that were conceived after liberation did not survive. Women who menstruated within the camps also had to suffer the shame of bleeding in public and also the discomfort of dealing with it. Women were certainly not given undergarments or menstruation rags or anything to deal with their periods within the camps. And however discomfort, how much this brought to women, it also brought a lot of female solidarity within the camps. Many older women taught younger women what was happening to them for the first time. Women shared resources. They had any strips of fabric that they could have, any pieces of paper in order to staunch bleeding, and many women say that this was like gold currency within the camps. Women shared. They did what they could. They helped people. A lesser-known fact about menstruation within the camps was that it also, in many cases, helped to save women from rape within the camps. Survivors often recount horrifying stories of almost being raped, and then their attacker found out that they were on their period and decided not to do so, as if menstruation is dirty and rape is not. Women navigated all of these experiences within the Holocaust with the help of other women. There are so many beautiful stories that you can pick from. Women that were giving other women large uniforms, whoever had the largest one within the barracks, so that they could hide women as their stomachs grew. Women that were hiding other women at roll call so that they wouldn't be discovered. Women that were consoling other women as their children had to be murdered so that they could survive. One woman later testified to the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, saying, "Without Dr. Pearl's medical knowledge and her willingness to risk her life to help us, it would be impossible to know what would have happened to me and many other female prisoners." She was the doctor of the Jews. On April 15th, 1945, as liberation rang and shouted throughout the camp, Dr. Gisela Pearl was busy. She was delivering a child in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And every other baby that she had delivered had to be murdered so that their mothers would survive. And yet this baby on April 15th was allowed to live. And it was the first child that survived within the concentration camps. After liberation, Dr. Pearl published her memoir in 1948, and it was entitled, as you can see here, "I Was a Doctor in Auschwitz." This was the first account of the Holocaust to attest to the reproductive and sexual horrors that women were forced to endure during the Holocaust. 1948, this was published. While this was published almost instantly after liberation, her stories and the stories of the women that she helped, that helped one another, the networks that they created, the amazing things that they endured, are still not widely known today. I also really, really like this image in the middle. This was Dr. Pearl after liberation at her Gynecology Institute, Mount Sinai Hospital in 1966, and she is the only woman in the picture on the bottom left. There are millions of stories that you can choose when you want to talk about women in the Holocaust, and that is the point. I actually had a really, really difficult time coming up with whose stories I wanted to talk about tonight because there are so many. They're everywhere. They're accessible. And they should not be read as a footnote to the rest of the history of the Holocaust. Their stories should be taught in schools and university classrooms. They should be on the walls of museums. They should be on the cover of books, and they certainly should not be a second-class narrative to the history of the Holocaust. Because when we teach about women's history, it benefits all of us. Women's history shouldn't be a token nod to women. It shouldn't be to add women to history and stir. It shouldn't only be talked about in the month of March, around commemoration days. Women's history is history, or herstory, as I like to call it. Their experiences are important, and they're necessary if we want to understand the past and how it operates in the present. Women experienced every facet of the Holocaust. So I encourage you, I empower you more than anything to walk out of these doors and remember their stories, speak their names, and include their contributions in the history of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Well, that was amazing. Let me see if this is on. Toot toot. Do we have it? Okay. Hi, guys. All right. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Another round of applause, please, for Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. And I, when you talk about these stories being everywhere, and to not just remember these women who you just spoke of, but to learn about other stories, where do you suggest people go when they leave and they want to know more? What resources are out there?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. First and foremost, we're right here, right? The Zeckelman Holocaust Center is right here. We are the only Holocaust center in the state of Michigan. And more than that, we are an education center. We teach people every day about this. We have archives full. We have a wonderful archivist that can tell you so much about these histories. There are books, right? You can do a simple Google search to find out about women in the Holocaust, right? These stories are everywhere. The survivors' testimonies are digitized through the places like Shoah Foundation, that you can actually find them for free online and listen to them yourselves. And I think, again, that's the most important thing, because it's not that they're not in the testimonies, right? Women had so many testimonies recorded, survivors after the Holocaust, that include this type of information, and yet again, we don't talk about it. So more than anything, I would encourage all of us to look towards your leaders in education. What are those resources that are vetted, that we can really trust, that we can learn about some of these difficult issues, and then spread the word from there?
Excellent advice. And what else are you doing in terms of your own research and your own academic pursuits?
Yes, so I am at the tail end of my dissertation. My advisor is here, who certainly didn't make me nervous at all. I think my defense will be easier than this, maybe. But in my own research, I'm looking at how women are represented within exhibit museums about the Holocaust throughout the United States. So the reason I really wanted to do this is our museums really act as the hubs of educational centers within all of the different states throughout the United States. And so if our museums, if those walls are not telling the stories of women, then how are everyday people learning about the Holocaust? Right? Most of us don't get the opportunity to learn about this in high school or college, or maybe you might be interested in it as a hobby afterwards. But if you don't particularly know to look for these stories, and they're not on the walls of institutions that are saying that these things are fact and that they should learn about them, then how are you going to understand these stories? How are you going to find them? So that's what my own research focuses on. I have been very lucky to have amazing mentors here at the museum. My boss, who is a boss in every sense of the word, Director of Education Ruth Bergman, has been an amazing charge for leading women's history in all of the programs that we run here at the museum. So it's my own research. I feel very lucky that I get to also carry that over in the work that I do here, and vice versa. And I'm just, again, very, very grateful to be able to do this work for people that should have their voices and stories told.
So Zeckelman obviously gets an A+ on their representation of women. What are some of the examples you've found elsewhere where maybe they're not doing as good a job?
Yes, so that's really interesting. It's often that women are represented within exhibits, but how are they represented? If you have a bunch of pictures of women all over the walls, but you're only presenting them in sort of images of maternal representations, then how are you looking at women that did a variety of other things, women that didn't have children within the camps, women that, again, were maybe like these resistance fighters or other people? It doesn't mean that women weren't maternal. It doesn't mean that that's not a part of their identity, but it means it's not the only part of their identity. We also have to see that, when we look at different exhibits, not one exhibit that I have found yet talks about sexual assault, rape, menstruation, all of these reproductive issues that really are integral to women's lives are absolutely absent. And I understand, I get it. We do not in any way, we want people to come in safely in and out of museums. The goal is not to traumatize people about the Holocaust. It's to empower them to do better when they learn about it. And so I get it, some of these things are difficult to talk about, but if you can have the word murder on the wall, you can certainly have the word rape. So these are the kinds of things that it's not that women are totally absent, but how are they being presented? And then unfortunately, a lot of times they are actually just absent.
Wow. Well, we appreciate the work that you're doing. I don't want to monopolize the conversation because I know folks out there have questions for you as well. So did you want me to just sort of head out into the audience and see who would like to ask a question?
We have two people for you that are going to roam around.
Okay.
Want to go up to the front? I'll get this one.
So my question is, have there been any studies done that talk about fertility or lack of fertility, or how fertility was affected after the Holocaust? I'm asking because obviously after such an event, when so many lives were lost, and you want to build up a population, but I'm just wondering how the infertility experienced in the camps affected the reproduction of the Jewish offspring of those who came out of the camps?
Yes, that's a very good question. So I always like to say that, we can have programs like this and we can do this kind of research because it stands on the shoulders of other women, other historians that have already done this kind of research. So because of sort of the fundamental research that women were doing about just general experiences of women in the Holocaust, now we're getting a lot more research that's coming out about these issues of infertility, menstruation, all of these things. So it's still not as researched as it should be, and we're still coming out. I mean, there's still new articles all of the time that, like, I am genuinely learning something new all of the time because this research is still being done. But again, these are still, when you go to a conference on academic history, it's still one panel on women. So you have all of these other historians that get to talk about anything about the Holocaust, and then there's that one women's panel that's typically less attended, right? So yes is the sort of short answer. The long answer is we have a lot more research to do in that regard, and I think that, as we're really combing through these testimonies, looking for, again, new answers to old questions, I think we're going to see a lot more research about infertility because it was an issue for many women. As I mentioned, again, there are a lot of women that their first child conceived after the Holocaust was not able to live. And so these are very much realities of people during this time.
I would appreciate if you'd explain the images and the poster up there and why they were chosen.
Yes, so that's a very good question. So there are people that are much smarter than me and much better at graphic design. And we basically wanted to show everyday images of women. We wanted to show that, yes, in the background, there are women that are doing labor, forced labor in one of the concentration camps. But in the foreground, these are women from one of the ghettos that were forced to wear Jewish stars as a way of identifying who they were. But they're everyday women, right? They're women that might look like your family members or people that you know, or older pictures that kind of harken back to your own family pictures. And that's what we wanted to show here. We wanted it to really be not necessarily faces and names that you always understand and remember when you hear about the Holocaust, but everyday women. The one in the upper right is actually, I believe that's a stamp from one of the concentration camps. Again, a good reminder that these things were not secret.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, hi, Katie.
Hi.
Her father did not want her to be a gynecologist because it was going to take her away from her religion. Why is that?
It's funny. I don't think, and I can't say for certain, but based on her memoir, it didn't seem that it wasn't because he didn't support her in her pursuit of learning about gynecology. It was more that he thought that the more that she became sort of secular and involved in education that was outside of the community, that she might sort of leave it a little bit. But for her, it was genuinely something that stayed with her entire life. She really has this just heart-wrenching story that she tells that after the war, when she was delivering babies within hospitals again, right before she would go in, right before she did the delivery, she would say a silent prayer and she would say, God, you owe me this child, right? You owe me that this one lives. So I don't think that it was that he in any way, didn't believe in her pursuits. I think that he just wanted that to always be a part of her identity, and it certainly was.
alone, without anyone, without men in her life, trying to make her way in the world and figure out how to turn lemons into lemonade, so to speak. Is there this kind of research being done and communication about the horrors that happened post
That's a very good question. So the question was about women's lives and the post-war period and how they struggled, often alone, to regain their lives and put them back together. That's a wonderful question, and there are certainly historians of the post-war period that do study this. But again, often we don't study just the everyday women. We have their testimonies, we have them recorded, we include them in our overall histories that we do, here at the center, but writ large, not so much. It's actually interesting, we're partnering the center with Wayne State University, who one of their classes is looking at some of our local testimonies and how these people ended up in Detroit after the war and what they did with their lives. And I actually got a phone call today by a woman that said, I can't find anything on this woman. Do you know anything about what happened to her? I can't find anything. I can't find an obituary. I can't find what she did, who she, the life that she lived. So I think that you point out a really important, good point, that there are still a lot of glaring holes in a lot of this scholarship that we need to do, that we need to be interested in. The Michigan Historical Society, Jewish Historical Society, does a lot of this work on people that came to Michigan, to the Detroit area, and a lot of that work is on women, which is really wonderful, and they're a wonderful resource. But again, it's a very good point that there certainly is a part two, absolutely.
Okay, so to keep up with the doctor, her story is absolutely fascinating. But what was her family structure like? Here she is trying to save the women and not the babies. What was her family structure like? Did she have children? Did she lose her children?
Yes, so that's a very good question. So her story is quite tragic. Upon entering the camp, she had a husband and 2 children, a son and a daughter, and her husband and her son were murdered within the gas chambers. And her daughter, she had no idea what had happened to her daughter for a long time, but she found out that she was actually hid outside of one of the ghettos, and she was able to reunite with her later in life. So this is something that, again, she did all of these amazing things, and it's not like she herself was not suffering too. I can't even imagine. I have 2 small children. I can't imagine what that would be like, not knowing where they are, let alone what's happening to them, who are they with. I mean, I think men, women alike, we all can understand, again, we can't actually understand, right? We were never in that circumstance. We hope never to be, and we certainly cannot walk in the shoes of somebody that experienced what these people experienced during the Holocaust. But I think, perhaps as parents, as humans, we can begin to understand how horrific that would be.
So my question is, how does the participation of women collaborators in the Eastern occupied territories who helped enact the final solution compare to the participation of German women like Irma Grisa who fulfilled similar roles?
That's a very good question. So we have this sort of issue of collaborators, right? There were women in many different parts of occupied countries, as well as men, that were very willing to help, right? They were happy to help. Unfortunately, we see that their participation was in a variety of different ways. When we think about the Holocaust by bullets, the over 2 million Jews that were murdered in fields and forests, not in concentration camps the way that in death camps, the way we often think. We also forget that who was making the meals for those men that was doing that dirty work in the killing fields? Right? Who was creating comfortable homes for them and barracks and letting them stay in their homes while they were moving through the Russian countryside? Right? So we can see that there were absolutely women from all different walks of life, from all nationalities and geographical places that were absolutely aiding in Nazi genocide. There were also a lot of really, really wonderful women in other countries that were also trying to help. So there are women that were righteous, that were not Jewish, that were trying to help people, even though it would have been no personal gain to themselves, right? I'm thinking of people like Miep Gies, who helped to hide Anne Frank and her family, and the others that were in hiding with them. She didn't do this for any reward. She did this because it was the right thing to do, right? With absolutely no gain to herself. So while it's easy, again, to focus on the perpetration, and we should focus on the perpetration, right? That should be a piece of it. But there's also so much light that I think that we can take from these stories, from these histories, that we can't forget that part too.
This is also a question about collaborators. In looking at, for example, a book like The Tattooist of Auschwitz, and there was a woman's story in this book that really haunted me because she was seen as a Nazi collaborator, a Jewish woman in the camp, who actually, because she was like the sex slave of a camp official, after the war, she was never really exonerated. Even though many in the same position were. So I'm curious, has any research been done, and are the collaborator stories among Jewish women more difficult to parse out because of the power, the physical power and the overpowering by German officials, that they really couldn't be represented fairly? I'm just curious if that's a topic that you've researched or that others are looking into at all.
Yes, that's a very good question. It's not a topic that I personally research a lot, but it's, I think, important to remember that part of the Nazi plan and the destruction of European Jewry was to make them complicit and make them active actors in their own destruction. So these ideas that the Jews were often forced to do the dirtiest work within the camps, the ones that were forced to move the bodies into the crematoriums, all of these things, as the story that you're referencing as well, it's not our place as historians to judge. We cannot in any way say what we would do if we were in this scenario. We could never do that. And so we have to give people with these stories some grace and understanding that humanity was completely flipped up on its head, right? And this idea that the Jews were often forced to do some of this dirty work themselves, they should not in any way be held accountable for that in many respects. So it's not research that I'm familiar with that's very common, but it is a really important topic to talk about.
Keep going for a long time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, I'm so glad to call you my coworker. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, PNC Bank. And thank you to all of you for attending. And we invite you soon in a couple of minutes to join us for a dessert reception. And of course, you can ask Katie a couple more questions. If you liked what you learned tonight, we invite you to please come to our next event, March 26th. We will explore the artwork of Eric Lichtblatt-Leslie, who survived Theresienstadt, and his act of spiritual resistance was to depict life in the camps, and it's a miraculous story. His sketches were hidden underneath the barrack floors and then retrieved after the war, and then he made large-scale paintings. They're hanging in our special exhibit right here in the center through April 30th. And so please come back March 26th. We will have a political cartoonist, homegrown from Grosse Pointe. His name is Phil Hands. He's now at the Wisconsin State Journal, and he will help us analyze the satirical nature of Eric's work. So please come back and join us. You can become a member. You can talk about membership with staff after we adjourn. And again, thank you so much for spending International Women's Day with us here at the Zeckelman Holocaust Center. Have a good night and drive home safely.